This episode is brought to you by Michelob Ultra. Michelob Ultra is perfect for more than just the summer heat this year, because not only is it refreshing and crisp with only 95 calories, but Ultra is also the official beer sponsor of Team USA at the Olympic Games Paris 2024. Celebrate every point, race, and moment with Team USA and Michelob Ultra for the Olympic Games Paris 2024. Stock up on Michelob Ultra and cheer on Team USA. Enjoy responsibly. Copyright 2024 Anheuser-Busch Michelob Ultra Light Beer, St. Louis, Missouri.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. We're driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/MBO. Terms and conditions apply.
Welcome to the Philosophemes podcast, where we do philosophy the traditional way. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Scalambrino. So grateful you're here. The Philosophemes podcast is proudly part of the Evergreen Podcast Network. If you're looking for excellent podcasts, you'll find them on Evergreen. Thank you for supporting and sharing this educational podcast. Any political or religious ideas discussed in this episode are solely for the sake of philosophical education. Everyone is welcome here on the Philosophemes podcast. The topic of this episode is the question: why does the philosopher go back into the cave? Plato's Republic is standardly divided into 10 books. Plato's Cave Allegory refers to a portion of the 7th of those 10 books. For those of you looking for chapter and verse, the Stephanus numbers are 514a to 521c6 in Plato's Republic. Of course, we could easily write a number of books about today's topic. It is immense, so we'll keep it manageable and brief here by speaking directly to the key points regarding Plato's Cave Allegory. So that means if we were to cut the Republic in half, the Cave Allegory would appear right at the end of the middle portion. This is significant, recall, because Plato liked to hide messages in the middle portions of his dialogues. So the first thing we see when we read the phrase Plato's Cave Allegory is that it is an allegory. So we know that it refers to a story that is open for interpretation, and that some of those interpretations are key because they open the story in a way that reveals hidden messages or hidden meanings. In a way that reveals hidden meanings. In order to understand Plato's Cave Allegory well enough, then, to answer our question, and that question, of course, is, why does the philosopher go back into the cave? We will quickly and briefly go over the story that is called the Cave Allegory. We'll answer the question, and then we'll consider how the answer to our question reveals a meaning that is hidden in the cave. For ease of communication, we could call this hidden meaning Plato's soteriology. Plato asks us to imagine prisoners chained up in the bottom of a cave. We are to understand that these prisoners are bound in such a way so that they cannot turn their heads. Their heads are held in such a way that they are forced to look directly in front of themselves. Some people think this is a reference to the way we experience the passing of time. The prisoners cannot turn their heads, but they can hear all around them, and they are able to speak to one another. There is a wall directly in front of them, so they are all viewing the wall. And Plato tells us that there are shadows being cast on the wall in front of the prisoners. Some people think this is a reference to our experience of our body's ability to sense its environment. Plato tells us that the prisoners engage in shadow games. trying to make predictions about future shadows based on patterns recognized watching past shadows pass by.
This episode is brought to you by Indeed. We're driven by the search for better, but when it comes to hiring, the best way to search for a candidate isn't to search at all. Don't search, match with Indeed. Use Indeed for scheduling, screening, and messaging so you can connect with candidates faster. Listeners of this show will get a $75 sponsored job credit to get your jobs more visibility at Indeed.com/MBO. Terms and conditions apply.
Plato tells us that we are to think about the experience of a prisoner in the cave once they are set free. Now, Plato famously never explains two parts of this story. We are at the first place in the story that Plato never explains to us. And that is, Plato never tells us how a prisoner is freed from his chains. However, Plato tells us when a prisoner is set free, the prisoner is then able to turn around and attempt to leave the cave if they want. If the freed prisoner does turn around and attempt to leave the cave, Plato tells us the experience will be unpleasant for them. The freed prisoner will experience the pain of their eyes as they adjust to the darkness, as they climb away from the false light casting shadows. Plato tells us this process is painful, and many freed prisoners, like Cypher in the Matrix, will only want to return to their chains as quickly as possible. Those who endure the process and continue on their quest to climb out of the cave will need to go past the position in the cave of the puppeteers. Those freed prisoners who, perhaps having won the shadow games, were raised to the position in the cave of a puppeteer who casts shadows for the prisoners. We are to suppose that the freed prisoner is tempted with the possibility of remaining in the cave for the sake of influencing the shadow play for the prisoners. However, Plato explains that there will be some freed prisoners who continue their ascent out of the cave and are liberated from the cave. Plato tells us that once outside the cave, the freed prisoner is able to see the real things to which the shadows in the cave referred. Think of it like this. If a chained-up prisoner saw the shadow of a tree, then we know that a puppeteer used some object to cast that shadow. And since we know the puppeteer is in a cave, we know the puppeteer didn't use a real tree. According to Plato, it would have been a statue of a tree. So suddenly we can see that Plato has identified the different parts of ascension out of the cave. Those levels are the shadows of objects at the bottom, then replicas of real objects, and then outside the cave there are the real things. Specifically in regard to the light outside the cave, we can differentiate between the things we see in the light and the light itself. Plato, of course, likens this to the light from the real sun, and Plato helps us understand that there are things outside the cave we can see with our eyes, and things that are too brilliant for us to look at directly. A helpful way to remember all of this is by thinking of something concrete. Let's pick a wheel. Okay, so as a chained-up prisoner in the cave, the prisoner would see a shadow of a wheel. In other words, they will see a representation, a representation of a wheel. The puppeteer level, then, would refer to an actual wheel. Thus, we have a representation of a wheel that is a shadow of an actual wheel. Then we have an actual wheel. And notice further what we can see about the relationship between the wheel and its shadow. The wheel is the condition for the possibility of its shadow. So as we ascend the cave, each level up is the condition for the possibility of the level below it. This may sound complicated, but it's not. We're just saying that you can't have a shadow of a wheel without a wheel, and therefore the wheel is a necessary condition for the possibility of its shadow. No wheel, no shadow. Of course, that relation is a one-way relation. It doesn't work both ways. In other words, it is possible to have a wheel without a shadow of that wheel, but you cannot have a shadow of a wheel without the wheel. All right, tough climb, right? We're almost there. So we can ascend the next two levels by navigating the level transition in the same way as the level transition from shadow to wheel. The necessary condition for the possibility of a wheel, then, would be, you guessed it, a circle. We are now in the realm of Platonic forms. You can have a circle without a wheel, but you can't have a wheel without a circle. Just like you can have a wheel without its shadow, but you can't have a shadow of a wheel without a wheel. Finally, circularity is the necessary condition for there to be a circle. If circularity were not possible, then there could not be a circle. And again, the same relationship can be seen. You can have circularity without a circle, but you can't have a circle without circularity, and so on all the way back down to the shadow of the wheel. To what then does circularity refer? In this analogy, circularity refers to the highest Platonic ideas. Like the light of the sun, we cannot look directly at them. Every time we draw a circle, we put material, matter, into the form of a circle. So the circle I draw on the board is not the Platonic form of a circle. It is a material instance of the form circle. Specifically, it is an instance of the form circle expressed by the material chalk. Okay, so Plato thinks that everything in the cave is conditioned by what is outside of the cave. Noted. And here is the second part of the story that Plato infamously never explains to us. If we put it into the form of a question, that question is, why does the freed prisoner return to the cave? Why does the freed prisoner go back into the cave? Plato never tells us why, but he tells us what the freed prisoner's experience would be like if they did. So after reminding ourselves what Plato says about the experience of re-entering the cave, we'll then be able to answer the question. When the freed prisoner returns to the cave, we call that person the philosopher. So when the philosopher goes back into the cave, their eyes will need to readjust to the darkness. And just like this was unpleasant on the way out of the cave, it will be unpleasant on the way back in. Upon arriving and telling the prisoners about the world outside the cave, the prisoners wouldn't believe the philosopher. And they would even say that it's best not to go outside the cave because it sounds like the philosopher's eyesight is ruined. They're no longer able to play the shadow games. Plato, and this is a clear reference to the actual Socrates, went so far as to say that the prisoners may even want to put the philosopher to death. So why does the philosopher return to the cave? Because once outside the cave, the philosopher recognizes itself as a thing outside of the cave. Like a form, like an idea, like the light from a shining star, and like these other things, the philosopher is immortal. You can break a wheel and destroy it, but doing so doesn't touch the form of circle. And every time a wheel manifests, it is the power of the circle that conditions it. Here, then, is the direct analogy. The level of shadows is bodily consciousness. The level of actual things is the level of the body. The level of the forms of actual things is the level of the soul, and the level of the ideas of the forms of actual things is the level of spirit. Of what then is the philosopher reminded? Let's put it this way. What does the philosopher recollect after leaving the cave? What is the philosopher's recollection? The philosopher experiences a gestalt shift from thinking of its being in terms of the play of shadows to thinking of its being as an immortal power, conditioning the reality of material beings. It was not the individuated being suffering through its life as whoever it thought it was. It was always already spirit shining into the darkness. And so, now, still, it shines bright in the darkness. Its return to the cave is like a perpetual illumination of the material dimension. The light delights in its lighting. In an intimate illumination, the darkness of the body and the light of the soul are engaged in an eternal recurrence, to which the philosopher says, amor fati. A picture of a wheel, a circle, and circularity. We save this being that we are, according to Plato, when we recollect that the soul is immortal, spirit is immortal, and we are spirit individuated, made into an individual by a body. An animal can die, spirit cannot die, and it is in this way that even reincarnation may be seen as joyful. And if helping others realize this is a form of, shall we say, saving all sentient beings, then Plato's secret soteriology is not just a message hidden in his cave allegory. It is him teaching us a method to wake up from the condition of identifying with this body and identify instead with the spirit that conditions its animation. All right. We are posting videos on YouTube and X, selling books on Amazon, and you can see the Philosophemes in puzzle form on Instagram. I appreciate your questions and comments and your support of this open access educational podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Frank Scalambrino, and I'll see you in the next episode.
Ever heard of Stoicism? Chances are, if you have, you've heard of Stoicism with a lowercase s and not Stoicism with an uppercase S. Lone wolves, no emotions, antisocial behavior, cold indifference. All that is Stoicism with a lowercase s. Stoicism with an uppercase S is the ancient Greek philosophy and virtue ethics framework that centers on service to the cosmopolis, to include your family, friends, community, and planet, and the development of a good moral character. My name is Tanner Campbell, and I'm the host of Practical Stoicism, a 3 times a week podcast teaching Stoic principles and concepts to anyone interested through the exploration of texts and deep dives into various moral topics. You can find Practical Stoicism where you're already listening to podcasts by searching for Practical Stoicism or by going to stoicismpod.com. I invite you to give it a listen today. You just might like it.